Hi, it's my birthday next week. In the industry I'm in, obviously I'm surrounded by birthdays. So I love birthdays and I've always loved birthdays. But turning 30 was really hard and turning 31 is way harder. It's like I'm in my 30s now. Like when I turned 30, it was like, you're starting your 30s. Now it's like, girl, you are in your 30s. But we march forward. I've decided on a really fun cake for me this year. I understand that you guys don't really know me at all because I'm brand new to this, but people in my world know that mac and cheese, specifically Kraft Dinner mac and cheese, is so important to me. So I'm making a mac and cheese cake and I'm bringing you along for the adventure. Come with me. We have to start with the boring stuff, so here I am layering the cake. These cakes actually just came out of the oven an hour or so before I got to the bakery this evening, so they're both still quite warm. So I'm just cutting them into layers and then throwing them in the freezer for a few minutes to cool them down before I start decorating. Don't make rookie mistakes. Don't try and ice a warm cake. For the mac and cheese box that's sitting beside my bowl of noodles, I measured the size of an actual mac and cheese box and printed out templates to match. In hindsight, I wish I would have cut them slightly smaller just because as soon as I added my buttercream and fondant, it did make it slightly bigger than a real box of Kraft Dinner, which obviously isn't a big problem. I'm just nitpicky. It still turns out so amazing. And now we get into the stacking. I always do a buttercream dam to keep my filling safe in between the layers of cake. And for this one, I went with a chocolate cake with chocolate ganache filling because that's my favorite and it's my birthday. We actually don't offer chocolate ganache as a cake filling option in the shop because it's quite expensive to make. But again, it's my birthday and it's my bakery. And then we're going to go in with a simple crumb coat. Your biggest goal with a crumb coat is to seal in all the crumbs from the cake and then also give your fondant a really nice, smooth, perfect surface to lay on. Any bumps or divots that are on your cake are going to show through your fondant, so you really want to make sure that it's nice and smooth underneath. Fun fact, when I first started making cakes, I was 16 years old and I had zero interest in anything to do with buttercream. I had gotten into cakes because I was watching Cake Boss and I learned about fondant and I was like, that is so cool. Let me play with that. And then I learned that you actually need to do a layer of buttercream underneath your fondant and I just couldn't do it. So I actually ended up having my little sister, who was 14 at the time, come in and crumb coat all my cakes for me and then I would lay the fondant on top. And we did that for years. Oh, how far we've come. Okay, we are moving right along here, and I'm doing the exact same thing I did for the mac and cheese box here on what will soon be the mac and cheese bowl. I did my vanilla buttercream dam, and then I filled it with chocolate ganache, and now I'm starting on my crumb coat. It's always a little trickier to crumb coat a carved cake rather than a cylindrical cake, just because things are a little less stable, but I find piping the buttercream onto the sides of the cake rather than taking a spatula right to the sides of the cake really helps with stability. And then I use this bendable scraper to smooth out the sides. If you are new to the cake world, I recommend putting your cake in the fridge or freezer for about an hour before starting your crumb coat. This just gives your cake a little more time to set up and really helps with the stability if that's something you struggle with. Okay, yay, we're at the fun part. I love fondant. I'm just using this mold I bought online to pop out these little letters. This is actually my first time using this specific mold and I love it. The letters are so cute and cartoony and the mold is really soft and bendable so the letters pop out really easily. A lot of people go in with cornstarch on their molds, but I just use shortening in my fondant to make it a little less sticky and they popped right out. You can't tell me these aren't the cutest letters you've ever seen. It's like the perfect mix of like handwriting, cartoony, bubbly, cutesy. I'm obsessed. Okay, welcome to the part that I was so excited for in the beginning and then quickly became the bane of my existence. I knew when I chose this design I'd be making a ton of little noodles, but I definitely underestimated how long each noodle would take and exactly how many noodles I had to make. I timed a few of them, and each noodle took anywhere from 40 seconds to a minute to make, and I had to make approximately 800 billion of them. So if you do the math, I was working on these all night and then I went back to the shop the next morning and was working on them again. If you're making this cake at home and wanting to save some time or bring the cost down for your customer because time is money, you could do a base of noodles that are just solid tubes without the holes poked into each side, and then just do the top layer of noodles more realistically. That is the route that I thought I was going to take, considering this cake was just for myself, but the perfectionist in me said absolutely not as soon as I got started. We're going to be here for a while as I knock out all these noodles, so while I've got you, how about a story time? I have this friend named Gareth, and we've been friends since I was about 18 years old and I was working my first bakery job. At this bakery, we were allowed to take home any cakes or cupcakes at the end of the day or week that didn't sell, and so occasionally I would show up at his house with a cake. On one of these cake days, he asked me if he could punch it. I'd never seen a cake get punched before, so obviously I said yes, and thus a tradition began where anytime Gareth was at an event with me where I made a cake, he would punch it. With permission, of course. He actually got married a couple years ago, and while I did make a beautiful classic wedding cake for him and his wife Julia, I also made him a groom's cake in the shape of the Death Star from Star Wars, and he had a ceremonial cake punch, and the thing flew across the room. At my 30th birthday party last year, he saw my over the top Barbie themed birthday cake, and he, of course, asked me if he could punch it. I obviously said yes because that's the tradition, and so after my friends sang me happy birthday and I blew out the candles, Gareth appeared out of seemingly nowhere and punched the thing. All my friends were horrified because I didn't think to warn them that this was not just something that we planned, but also something that we do all the time. And in hindsight, I really should have let them know. But at least now they know for next time. Okay, I am now softening up some light blue fondant to cover my cake board with. We don't cover cake boards in fondant for every cake order, really only if the design calls for it specifically or if the customer specifically asks for it, but I just think it's a perfect finishing detail rather than having the cake sit on a plain white or silver board. It's super easy to do. You just roll out your fondant as usual, and then I put a thin layer of shortening on the cake board itself. And then you just drape your fondant over the cake board, and I use a fondant smoother to smooth out any air bubbles that might get caught underneath. And then just use an X-Acto knife to trim off the sides, and you are done. The only thing you really have to look out for with a fondant covered cake board, especially while it's still like freshly done, is that the fondant is really soft. So anything you're putting on top of this board, you have to just be really wary of not ruining the fondant underneath it. Macaroni time. I am rolling out a really thick piece of yellow fondant that's the exact same color as the noodles that I made so that it blends in perfectly when the noodles are placed on top. Fondant is typically never this thick, but the bowl I made was a little bit shorter than I wanted it to be, so I'm using this fondant to bring up the height a little bit. And then for the sides of the bowl, I'm rolling out my white fondant, also pretty thick because I want it to look like a thick plastic bowl, and I'll need the upper rim of the bowl to reflect that. When you're working with fondant, there's lots to remember, but I really feel like there's two big things. Number one, make sure you lay down lots of cornstarch on your surface before rolling it out so it doesn't stick to your table. And number two, work quickly. Fondant dries up quite quickly, and if you're too slow with it when you pick it up to place it on your cake, you're going to end up with what we call elephant skin, and that's where the top layer of your fondant has dried from sitting out too long. So when you pick it up to move it, it stretches out and you get this wrinkly texture and a bunch of cracks on your fondant instead of that smooth finish you're looking for. So after I've rolled it out, I lift it up and wrap it around my cake, and then I use an X-Acto knife to cut off the excess. There's lots of tricks on how to hide fondant seams like this, but I'm just ignoring it because, again, it's my birthday cake and I don't really care about it. And then I just use my X-Acto knife again here to cut off the top edge and reveal the rim of the bowl. I'm really sorry about the camera angle here. I didn't realize that you can see absolutely nothing. And then I'm just going in with my fondant smoother again to smooth out any flaws. I was so excited about this part, and this is when I realized that all the noodles I made on this night were not enough. Like literally a third of what I needed. It was honestly quite disheartening. So here I am the next day. I spent a couple more hours making a bunch more noodles, and here I am loading them all on. And it is so satisfying watching them all fall into place here. It looks so realistic, and I'm so happy with it. I just used a steamer that you can see in the background there to steam the whole top of the cake, which makes all the fondant really sticky. So when I dropped all the noodles onto the top of the cake, they all just stuck in their spot. And then the last couple pieces I placed kind of strategically by hand. And now we're moving on to the mac and cheese box. I am just taking some of my pre-made blue fondant and adding dark blue food coloring to it to get it to that like deep royal blue color that I'm looking for. This is a messy job. I highly recommend gloves and a lot of patience, and I use a lot of shortening in my fondant when I'm dyeing it to keep it from sticking all over the place. And then I roll it out and lay it on top of my cake. I feel like I'm going to start repeating myself if I tell you again how to roll out fondant, but here it is. Once you get your fondant on top of your cake, you kind of want to pull it out and then press it down, and that will help avoid getting folds in your fondant. And then there are lots of options for how to trim off your excess. I like to use this little rubber spatula. I've been doing it this way for basically my whole life. One of my decorators on my team likes to use a little like pizza wheel cutter, another likes to just use a regular knife. It's all up to you. I just can't do it any other way but with this little plastic spatula. And then I'm going in with my fondant smoother again. These things are honestly your best friend in the world of fondant cake decorating. When I first started making cakes, I was told you don't really need them. And then as soon as I got my hands on them, I was like, what do you mean you don't need them? This changes everything. This is what I use to get all my edges really sharp. You just kind of press one up against the side of the cake and then use the other one to press the fondant into it, if that makes sense. That's what gives you really, really sharp corners. I decided to go with edible images for the labels on the macaroni and cheese box. It is super easy, super quick, and super perfect. I contemplated hand making these details for about 0.2 seconds before I ran straight to my edible image printer. These are just printed on sugar sheets, and I just use an X-Acto knife to peel it off, and then they lay on the cake perfectly. This is my favorite part of the whole process is when it all comes together. So I drop my box onto my covered cake board here, and then I'm taking all my letters that are now pretty dry and I'm pressing them onto my cake board. I did use my steamer on the cake board just for a second to make it a little bit tacky so that those letters stay in place. And when you're placing your letters, I always recommend starting with the middle letter and then working outwards so that everything is centered. And I really cannot stress enough how much I love these letters. They are so cute. I'm so happy with how this is all coming together. I used my steamer once again to steam the macaroni and cheese box before placing the edible images on the side. This just makes it nice and tacky and gives it something to stick to. You can also use shortening to stick your edible images onto fondant, but this method is a lot easier, a lot quicker, less messy, and then you're also not like eating a ton of shortening when you cut into this cake. And here we go, the most important part. This was so satisfying to lay down, and the whole thing just came together so quickly. And then I went in and steamed the whole thing once more just to make the cake board nice and tacky, and then went in and added some sprinkles because if you know me, you know I love sprinkles. And then she was done. I did end up adding a little spoon and some noodles to the board as well, just for funsies. And then it was off to dinner. And my sister ended up daring me to take a bite of the fondant noodles, so here's that.
Grab dinner.
At least it's not cheese flavored. Okay, come here. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Rachel.